Welcome back to the Automation Podcast, the world's #1 industrial automation product and technology show. Thanks to you, our audience of highly skilled automation professionals. Thank you for being a member of our audience, and thank you for tuning back in this week. Now, for those new to the show, my name is Shawn of Insights in Automation, and each week I invite a new vendor to come on the show to tell us about their products and technologies. And during the presentation, I play the role of the audience, asking questions I think you have, and of course, questions I have as well. With that said, given that a quarter of our audience doesn't watch but listens to the show, right? So whether they're on Apple or they're on Spotify or they're on YouTube, a lot of you told me, hey, I listen to you while I'm doing other things. So because of that, I'll try to call attention to any details in the visuals that I think you listen-only folks may want to know more about. And with that, I want to welcome back Adam. He's been on the show. This is a third appearance. He's from Copia Automation. He's told us all about Git Base Source Control. He's told us about Device Link. And it's great to have him back. It's been about 18 months. So he's back on to tell us what's new and happened. He's got some exciting things going on. And so with that, Adam, I kind of built you up really big. Can you, before we jump in and talk about what's going on with your company, can you just give us a little introduction for those who are new to the podcast of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm definitely excited to be on the show again. And in this, we'll be talking about, industrial DevOps and building out this idea of this industrial DevOps platform and set of practices. But the component pieces are source control, device link. So it's almost like that natural progression from the shows we've done. So it's super fun to be back. In terms of my background, as you mentioned, I'm CEO and founder at Copia Automation, working on Copia for half a decade now. Company was kind of formally founded 4 years ago. Before Copia, I was kind of grew up as a software engineer. I was on engineering strategy at Uber, where I worked on the overall backend systems architecture. My skip level was the CTO as part of the office of the CTO. I was working on driver platform features, so also just how you scale the driver app. For that, kind of maintaining exponential growth within the headcount of the engineering team there. So I kind of cut my teeth in DevOps and then moved into the industrial automation world, focusing specifically on, how can we bring those DevOps practices from the IT world and make them work within the OT environments that everyone who listens to your podcast is familiar with. So we'll dig into a lot of that story of how that works and the problem and how our platform solves it, along with just generally thinking about, industrial DevOps as a set of practices. So with that, I'll just jump right in. We'll go through a few different things today. We'll focus on, I'll give a little overview of Copia. I just did. I'll go a little bit more detail just so you all know a little bit more about me and where I come from, the problem, that we're kind of facing, the solution, thinking about Copia Industrial DevOps platform, as well as industrial DevOps generally. Throughout this, happy to answer, questions as well. So Copia at a glance, and this is kind of fun because, we've probably given flavors of this slide across our different showings, but we were founded in 2020. We started shipping product to users in early 2021. Since 2020, Copia has raised $30 million of funding from top investors who tend to be, invest in the industrial space generally. So the boards of various other kind of fast growth, high impact industrial vendors. Copia has seen consistent growth and adoption. We have over 2,000 developers using the product now, and 135 customers, individual, companies using the product. We try and compose our team of world-class talent from the IT and OT space, given that the blend of the product is from both the spaces. And we have companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, as well as industrial vendors like Siemens and Rockwell and all those as well within our company. So we do really try and maintain a foot in both ponds in terms of IT and OT. So in some sense, our company itself is an IT-OT convergence business. And our platform has demonstrated best-in-class stickiness. We have high user satisfaction, consistent growth, and product engagement. And so that's Copia, but you'll hear me talk a lot about industrial DevOps, and this is something that we're really big on. And for the people who are just listening, on the screen, we have kind of this timeline of DevOps. But DevOps is now at this point around a over 15-year-old set of practices. It's kind of born in 2007 to 2008 in the IT space. There was lots of traction gained through conferences, thought leadership, et cetera. In 2012, the State of DevOps report is established. In 2013, the Phoenix Project further builds the case for widespread DevOps adoption. Gartner in 2016 predicts mainstream adoption I'd say by 2016, you're already seeing that the top tech companies, in the world had adopted these practices. At Uber, we had already been doing them for 2 or 3 years at this point. Companies, and we were hiring out companies like Google and Facebook, et cetera, where these are standard practices. Microsoft is a major contributor to Git, and I had to use GitHub. A couple of years later, obviously GitHub gets acquired by Microsoft. Forrester calls in 2017 this the year of DevOps. So DevOps begins by then 2010s becomes very, very hot. And I'd say, you get to a standard set of practices in that time period around Git and Git-based practices and test-driven development, monitoring and alerting. A lot of the modern DevOps tools by the late 2010s have been established. In 2020, we found it with the goal of taking that kind of success that had been borne out over 12, 13 years and bringing it to the OT space. A book came out last year by Dr. Suzette Johnson and Robin Yemen, which is focused on industrial DevOps. So, we'll be publishing the first annual State of Industrial DevOps report, which should come out, actually probably comes out between this recording and when we publish. And then in 2024, Frost and Sullivan names industrial DevOps the top 15 growth opportunity in industrial automation. So we've kind of seen this in some senses. We're in this we're almost in the 2012 or 2011 of DevOps adoption in the IT space, where it's becoming recognized. We have an industry report, industry analysts are recognizing it, and we're seeing amongst our customers and opportunities that people are familiar with the term and are thinking about it in terms of their strategy. And so my hope here, as I'm sharing this out with everyone here, is that they're thinking about their overall OT strategy within their organizations and thinking about industrial DevOps as a component of that strategy. And as you'll see specifically around governance and control of the code that actually runs your plant, of the OT devices there, and thinks about specifically in a way of driving efficiency for your engineering teams, doing more with less for the engineers you have in terms of driving uptime, and ultimately driving quality in terms of the production that you set up and the end product that you develop. All these beautiful faces that you all can't see on the podcast are our leadership team, from me as founder CEO, Matt, our VP of business development, Ben, Andrea, Margaret, Abby. So we have a strong team, again, brought cross-functionally across this group. You have Rockwell, you have Siemens in this group, but you also have me from Uber, you have best-in-class IT folks as well. So with that, any questions on this? Then I can dig into the problem coming out of that stuff.
No, I would just say if people want to get more of the background, just check out the previous episodes. We had Copia on. We kind of dived into a lot of that Git stuff really deep. So go ahead, Adam.
Yeah. And I think the big thing, just to leave everyone with is, as we dig into the problem, is, these are a set of practices. And as you mentioned, this is our third time on the show, but we've been talking about industrial DevOps for 4 years. And so I think the exciting time, especially for people who are tuning in right now for the first time, is these are becoming recognized practices. And as we're talking to more and more customers and more opportunities, and more people are coming into our sphere of conversation, we're just seeing that term kind of take off. And I saw, a talk in Germany around industrial DevOps, that didn't have any vendor that was talking about industrial DevOps. So just a group of, people talking about, how do we bring these practices into our organization? So we're actually seeing people use this terminology and think about this, and obviously picking that up in analyst reports and that sort of thing. So I think it's a real term, it's a real set of problems, which I'll talk through, that are industry wide. And I think there's a set of practices that are coming together that I'll try and share out in this that can be transformative for controls engineering organizations. So the problem, this is a fun one, but trillions of dollars of global production distribution rely on workflows that are fundamentally broken. And you can kind of see here, and I think everyone who's in the OT space has run into this, of proprietary file types. Every vendor does something slightly different, bespoke protocols, opaque interfaces, physical file sharing. People don't test their code a lot. There is some testing, but it's either expensive SIMs, or there's some platforms that support some amount of unit testing, and ultimately very limited visibility into the operations, of what's actually happening. So something breaks and you don't know why, is a really common situation in the industrial plant floor. And so all of these make it really hard to build the workflow that our product sells for. And then speed to market is a survival imperative. Obviously, we see a lot of production coming up, and we see that a lot of building is bottlenecked by industrial code. And so, obviously, on top of that, you have, some of this cyber OT questions. is around ransomware attacks. There's a lot of access that people have to third-party access to OT environments. So you run into, for example, air gapping as a standard practice. But then people can actually just kind of connect to an industrial network and get access to these devices. So actually visibility into changes is a major part of security. And a lot of time we actually get brought into sales process because people have a ransomware attack or they need disaster recovery because of they need disaster recovery because they actually had a situation that happened. So, and that's a very, very common situation. Or as IT/OT convergence starts to happen, CIOs and CISOs take over the networking that exists on the plant floor. They see it as a security gap. And so this is part of that overall IT/OT convergence story is like, how do you actually lock down the devices there? And then, generally speaking, as we talk about DevOps, this is the outcome of applying the most trusted principles in the domain of physical manufacturing leadership to the IT stream. So it's kind of interesting. There's this kind of circular thing that has happened where, you have lean manufacturing, all these practices, then got applied to IT. IT adopted them, built DevOps, and now it's kind of spreading back into OT. So there's kind of an interesting thing here where we think about this as like an IT came up with all this stuff, but actually IT, in the early 2000s, they came up with this or borrowing from, Toyota lean manufacturing, all of that stuff in order to come up with DevOps, in order to come up with the Agile. And now we're seeing this almost like, kind of circling back into the OT world. When we talk about the IT DevOps approach, and there's a lot of stuff that is bucketed under DevOps, but when we talk about it at Copia and the way that I think about it, it's tied to a standard set of processes that go from the code being written in your IDE. Once that work's complete, how does it actually get onto a device? And so what that looks like is Git Base Source Control and collaboration. If you're putting everything in a good version control system, you can do recovery faster and you can actually root cause issues. It's very common for people, for example, to power cycle or reset a PLC without root causing an issue when it happens in production. And so having that kind of change history, understanding what broke or why a particular rung might exist, your ladder or whatever can help you recover, but also root cause. Automate testing. How do you catch issues before they become production issues? Deployment management. How do you actually get code on the plant floor in an efficient and safe way? I've heard before people having to physically fly out, to plants and that sort of thing as well. How do you actually gate the processes by which code gets deployed? Also on the flip side of that, you get people now who, especially after COVID, VPN into plants and just deploy code changes remotely. So how do you actually manage and gate deployment and production, and then observability and monitoring, like what's actually changing? Do you actually have visibility in what's changing in those environments? And so that's the IT approach. But what you see in the current industrial world, is a lack of backups and outdated file storage, which leads to extended downtime, manual testing. People are testing in production. They're turning on production to see if it works. There's obviously expensive SIMs and unit tests and that sort of thing that exists in some places, but it's often, or digital twin in the more extreme case. There's a lot of vision on how to solve this problem, but the reality is most of the time people push a change, and honestly the standard in a lot of environments is online changes, in order for people to maintain uptime, but then you actually run into risk of breaking things in production. So how do you actually test your code before you're making those changes to make them safer? Manual deployment, people actually going out to sites to deploy. Obviously, line of sight is a requirement in a lot of cases, but going machine by machine to do deployment, and limited observability, which means that you don't actually know what's happening. On top of that, and so this is all stuff, as you mentioned, that we've talked about before in this group. But one interesting thing, and is this, we've actually now tried to determine, is this something that we were kind of thinking about as a problem? And 4 years ago, obviously, when I started the company, it was a little bit like, hey, I talked to a few people. Seems like a lot of people had this problem. More and more people I talked to seem like they had to. I've probably spoken to 1,500 manufacturers. Almost none of them have not had some flavor of these problems now. But this State of Industrial DevOps report that we put together, which I'm sharing here, talks about this. And we actually surveyed an anonymous survey of 200, industrial engineering leaders to ask them, is this real? Like, what are these problems? What are you seeing in these environments? And the results were really astounding. So we were seeing $4.2 million as the average cost of downtime. The interesting thing here, which is when I first showed this number to some people, they were actually really surprised by it. instead of seeing really high. One of the interesting things we found out is as you go higher in a leadership chain, they consider the outage more expensive, which is probably a result of them seeing more of the downstream effects. So you can imagine, dependencies on supply chain. You can imagine insurance costs, legal costs, reporting to the board. All of these things come into creating actually cost of resolution over time, engineering hours that goes into it. So a lot of people think of cost of downtime in terms of, hey, we produce this amount of product per hour. If it's 5 minutes delayed, we lost that amount of product. But there's actually a lot of secondary costs that become more obvious as you go up the site. 50% attributed to PLC code related challenges. I think this is probably shocking to a lot of people. But it's something that we've also reified in terms of our analysis of some of our customers as well. But what we typically see is there's actually a huge amount of PLC related changes in these environments. People resolve mechanical and electrical issues at the code layer because it's more flexible and then cause a downstream problem. And so we see frequent challenges in industrial environments due to code changes. The other reason for this data point is there's just a lot more code in production. And this is actually even since 5 years ago when I started talking to people about Copia, there's a lot more code in these environments, huge demand for industrial automation machinery. And you see that you just have, even compared to 20 years ago, just a lot more software driving these environments, which means that you're going to have more errors in that layer. It's also hard to attribute those because they often manifest as mechanical or electrical issues. So you hear someone say something like, the PLC stopped working. Right, which doesn't actually really make sense because ultimately you had to make some sort of code change or configuration change or something, or there's some sort of logic error that kind of triggered. And this again gets to people like power cycling or resetting or something to resolve an issue. But ultimately we see that there's a huge amount of issues that are at the code layer. And then we see frequent mistakes are getting made. And it takes a long time to fully resolve each of these downtime events. So, this gets into that secondary cost of, yes, there's a cost of the outage itself, but there's also cost of resolving it. So we're seeing frequent errors and changes in these environments. As you have more automation, you just have more changes that are happening. It becomes a larger surface area for outages. And this is obviously pretty awesome because we were able to pull it from 200 industry folks who were able to kind of anonymously give us this feedback. And then, one of the big things we see here as a common cause of this, and I think this is actually the most common use case in where device link and more governance and control and actually having a process for making changes in your environment becomes really challenging, is that one of the biggest areas that cause these sorts of outages are ad hoc fixes. So we often see that, I'm just going to make a small change and then it causes an outage, right? And so we see that a frequent cause of these changes is not like a massive new production going up, but it's someone making a small change in a production environment and then causing an outage. And so, this becomes a major kind of systemic problem within a plant as you're seeing, hey, we're having these outages, some of them, again, mechanical, some of them are electrical, but some of them, we say the PLC is executing wrong or restoring the previous version of our code resolved the issue, but we don't know if it's a code change. Well, there's a strong indicator if resolving the previous version of your code solved the problem. So there's kind of these frequent set of small changes that are happening as part of a maintenance sustainment motion that actually cause kind of massive downstream issues. Any questions on that? And I can dig into.
No, that made sense, Adam. That made a lot of sense the way you presented that.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy thing is, essentially I've realized as we've dug in really deep in this space, in most sustainment situations where you have a lot of automation code, people will resolve outages going through a series of different steps. One is they'll first reset their device. 2, they'll then power cycle if that doesn't work. 3, they'll just try and ship a backup in there. And then if they have someone who's really aware of the code, they'll actually make a code change. And what that means is you've just pushed the issue down the stack because you haven't actually root caused it, right? Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, you have this kind of ongoing maintenance cycle that essentially looks like people not really having any visibility of what changed, and they just basically brute force production, and you start to create these kind of systemic, cowboy and firefighter, we've called it, sort of issues where things are just breaking all the time, and there's a lack of visibility into why.
I was just talking to a young man who was in my courses yesterday, and he goes out and service calls to all kinds of different companies making everything from, bagels to anything you can imagine. And that's where you see a lot of this happening because they don't have that trained staff. And so, but that's not to say that your product's not good for trained staff, it's actually a godsend for trained staff. An expert engineer can understand what you're going to go through here right now. We saw in previous appearances is this helps everybody, not just the person who may not be as as experienced as somebody's been doing this 20, 30, 40 years. This solution is good for all users. And I'll turn it back to you. Yeah.
No, that's a great point, and I do want to call out too that a lot of what I've seen in a lot of, especially more enterprise organizations, is increased centralization of top talent in organizations, or contracting out to system integrators who are doing support. So, where we actually, to your exact point, see like a big value add here is if you are an expert user of the product and you're trying to support a site, in general, being able to say, like, here's what changed. I'm going to go actually fix the code or the underlying logic problem, or maybe I'll do a backup. I'll use a backup and then I'll go fix it, as a follow-on step. You mitigate and then you resolve, becomes a powerful workflow for exactly those users who are either, working at a plant and they're seeing some of these issues come into place, or they're supporting plants as part of a more centralized corporate team or integrator. This ends up being useful. And those are the people that, by the way, I'll say also often bring us into organizations, right? Because they understand the value add of being able to actually root cause an issue. Whereas like a less trained person who's maintaining a plant floor, they're just like going to try and keep production working because they freak out for good reason when production stops, right? So cool. But thank you for calling that out, and I'll dig into this as well. But ideally, yeah, this is ultimately a workflow that should help professionals who are supporting in these environments. And so, for us, when we talk about our solution, our mission is to deliver an order of magnitude improvement in industrial scale production. And this starts with industrial DevOps and these set of practices that I talked about earlier. One way to say this is like we want to be able to change the scale and scope of production. We want people to be able to maintain more industrial automation. We want to support more increasingly automated environments and increasing scale of industrial production through those increasingly automated environments. And I think that's just happening. So there just is a lot more industrial automation because there just aren't people to do a lot of these operator roles over time. And people are leaning more and more in automation to automate processes they might have hired people for in an alternative universe or previously. And so we think we're really supporting those people that are supporting, the next generation of industrial automation, the next generation of scale of industrial automation with these workflows. And so when we look at our platform, we're looking for end-to-end visibility and control. So this gets a little bit to someone makes a change and something breaks, but also being able to root cause issues, looking at, the code that's on the device, validating it, multi-vendor source of truth. So one of the big benefits of our product is that it's multi-vendor, making sure our cloud management's really easy and secure. This is a big question that always comes up for us, at least for SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. And then, this is almost like table stakes, but is often how we get brought into conversations is rapid disaster recovery. So it's well accepted. Generally speaking, they should have a disaster recovery plan. All these things enable you to capture that disaster recovery benefit that is well understood as an accepted best practice and necessary sort of tooling in this space. But the industrial DevOps vision gets you to a world where you are actually preventing issues before they become production issues. And so when we look at industrial DevOps, we're really looking at reducing downtime and improving the efficiency of teams, automating processes and enabling people to operate in a more streamlined way. Who's Copia today? So our platform is focused on two things, both of which we've shared in the space but matured over time. Git Base Source Control. Git obviously is a standard tool in the IT space, software space that's been around. Millions of people use it, every day, and to track code changes in this environment. Then device link automatic backup, which actually tells you, if something has changed. And this is the last bullet on this list to the right, is visually comparing code in one place for quick troubleshooting and recovery. So what that looks like is Git Base Source Control is preventative. You're doing code review and practices to check your code before you put in production. Device link tells you if there's something in production that you weren't expecting, right? So someone makes a change, we do a backup, we say, hey, this changed. So it's preventative actually in the sense of it tells you that something has changed, that you can catch it before it becomes a production issue. But if you don't, then it becomes this outage happened rather than power cycling, resetting our code, just taking the last backup and blindly installing it or whatever the standard mitigation practices are. Those are actually still fine mitigation practices. You can then go one step deeper, as you mentioned, and actually debug your code changes. Cool. And this is a visual of Git Base Source Control. So one of the big things that we bring onto the space is also this kind of multi-vendor visual environment. So you can actually visually see what changed in your industrial environment. This makes it really easy to debug because you can say, rather than being like, hey, we have these two files, the one on the machine and the one sitting on our USB stick, you can say, hey, I see in my browser that yesterday there's a code change to these 3 rungs, and wow, that's actually the outage that I have, right? So it enables you to very quickly debug these issues. And Device Link, again, as I mentioned, has this monitoring and observability aspect to it, where you can view what's running, scheduling backups, and all that stuff, and comparing, what's on the plant floor with what you think is in your source control.
Before you go much farther, could you, just for the audio audience, could you tell them what vendors you support now with that visual display of the differences?
Yeah, I think, So with that, Rockwell automation. So we go pretty broad now and pretty deep. So we do Rockwell automation. I think it might be everything since V16 of Studio 5000, but don't quote me on that. There might be some gap in the middle there. Code Assist. Siemens, we do TIA Portal, I believe from V14 to the most recent version, which I think is V19, and Step 7, I believe that's 5.5 and 5.6. Schneider, Beckhoff, Wago, because it uses Code Assist under the hood, ABB, and then we actually support BNR as well. So we have pretty broad and deep vendor support for the visual code changes within the space. And our goal is, out of the box, we're supporting, probably the bulk of the PLC vendors that you have on the plant floor.
Yeah, that's a good list. Yeah.
Yeah, it's taken a lot of work to go deep there, but I think it's kind of still table stakes if we want to actually deliver the value that we want to deliver in this space. So, and then with Device Link, it's worth calling out that we go even further than that because we support a number of those vendors, but we also support SFTP, SCP, FTP as well. Which means that we can support like a variety of edge devices, as well. So often what we see is like we support the set of PLCs when we come to the site. We already have integrations for standard robots like FANUC or something like that, and common devices like Cognex or a key sensor or something like that. Mm-hmm. But as we get a little bit deeper, we'll often find that people have peripheral devices, and then it's fairly easy to build support for those as part of our overall integration step. So if we want to support like a Stratix switch or something like that, we can build those sorts of integrations pretty quickly given the architecture that we have in place. Dashboards and visual jobs. So, again, this is just showing, what's changing in the environment. And we actually support dashboarding. So one of the common ways that people can use this product now that we see is actually on day one, you want to plug in Device Link to understand what's there. And then you want to see what changes are just coming into your environment before you even think about source control, right? And so this gives you visibility into, hey, there's all these changes happening. And this actually gets to the fact that people actually don't have that much visibility into these changes to begin with. Some of these look pretty gnarly potentially. How do I build better process to prevent those issues? So you kind of get that from day one with just Device Link integration. And then again, it's always worth calling out best-in-class security. There's a bunch of different things, but the big thing called SOC 2 Type 2 audits. We're regularly audited. We have best-in-class, essentially cloud security. We also support a self-hosted version of the product, not on-prem, but actually in the enterprise cloud for enterprise customers that need a more specialized deployment as well. So we can, for example, deploy on someone else's AWS if they prefer that, and we often see that in larger enterprise customers that they want to maintain and operate their own deployment in the cloud. Any questions on that stuff as we dig in?
No, I think that was straightforward, and it's good to know. And don't want to, some plants may be so concerned about intellectual property that they do want it on premise. But I think many of the large companies will have their own cloud, their own private cloud. And so it's good that you support all three. And for the smaller customers, they can just use your cloud. They don't have to do anything, right? So it's a good mix of options there.
Yeah, we definitely see. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of standard we see is like, more SMB type customers or, commercial segment of the market, mid-market, tends to be okay with a public cloud offering with the right security practices in place, especially, forward-thinking CIOs and CISOs. And then as you get to enterprise, just the scale and scope of the deployment often drives them to want to kind of have a little bit more operational control. And then also, they have, deals with a lot of the cloud vendors and that sort of thing as well that enables them to, they want to use some of that spend there and, make sure that they're leveraging the kind of scale of purchasing that they make within those vendors. So, yeah, and then I'll say, just you mentioned on-prem is, increasingly we do see people more and more comfortable with the cloud. So I think it's definitely an interesting kind of evolution over the last 5 years since we started the company. Although certainly there's people that really they just want the on-prem deployment. So cool. I mean, I think it's worth calling out. This is a list of customers here. We work with a lot of different customers, enterprises, mid-market, SMB. So we see a large variety of customers here. And one of the big things is it is industrial horizontal. So we work across a bunch of different industrial verticals. That should be intuitive to the people in your audience, but it's often something that people ask us, what vertical do you prefer to work with? And we actually see that we can work with a lot of verticals as long as, we have a good technology match. And that again gets into some of these vendors that you and I that we just talked about on the previous slide. One of the big things here is especially as you get into more scale, but even if you look at a single plant floor, you tend to have a lot of different vendors at that plant. You might have different CNC machines, you might have different sensors. We see Fanuc robots with Rockwell automation as a common pairing that happens. And so you get this kind of multi-vendor environment, and our goal is to drive consistency across those different vendors. So this is a set of the vendors that we support. On our website, we have more detail on this in terms of supported vendors. But the one other thing I'll call out is oftentimes we're working with customers as part of our integration, especially as you get to peripheral devices, to support a very bespoke or very specific device. So there's kind of a long tail of vendors in this space that we often kind of work as part of our deployment stuff to work.
You already mentioned Cognix. You mentioned other companies like Cognix that do that kind of stuff. But you went kind of through a quick list of all those smaller companies that we cover on the morning show. I did want for the audio audience just to mention some of your customers, including Oshkosh, including Chewy, which I know we use, my wife uses, and then because we have dogs, and then Amazon. So some of these you guys may not recognize. I don't recognize them all, but those are three big kind of names that you may have heard of, in outside of work. So I just figured I'd throw that out for those listening.
Oh, I also will call out for Amazon in particular. They actually published a case study of Copia on their, because we're also partners with AWS. Mm-hmm. So there's a published case study of kind of our impact there that I think we talked about on a little bit of a later slide on this, but I can also share out afterwards if it's useful.
Yeah. I was reading that press release and that was very impressive. Just for the audience, what are some of the, so if you, on the next slide, you had the big PLC guys, right? These are the big automation houses. But, I'm interested in, you kind of rattled off it kind of quickly, some of, like I see Lens here, but you talked about Cognix. Could you throw out some of those other, maybe those smaller companies that you're doing, maybe the FTP or SFTP with to back up their configurations, in addition to Cognix?
Yeah, like Cognix, Keyence, Fanuc's on here. A lot of robots actually just use, SFTP servers. Yep. So that's pretty common outside the PLC world. So most of those we end up building integrations for. So,
and when you're doing network switches, I mean, is that also secured FTP, or do you typically do something else to get you mentioned a Stratix switch? You want to get that configuration file?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, so we did build an integration for a Stratix switch somewhat recently. And that was actually, I think, a fairly straightforward integration. I think it took us like a couple of hours with our existing infrastructure to build that. So that's another example. We don't have support for it right now, but we've looked in documentation for like an Atlas Copcode controller or that sort of. Yep. And those some of the more modern ones use SFTP there. So we certainly see a fair number of those. So
now, if a vendor's a little jealous and they're not on this list, is there somebody they contact at your facility to say, hey, I think we got a customer that would like to use you, but we need you to support us, especially if it's SFTP or FTP. That should be fairly simple. Is there somebody at your, do you have a corporate relations with other companies that they can contact?
Yeah, so we have a person who leads our business development, Matt Lee. He's actually also a co-founder. But people can reach out to me directly as well over LinkedIn or Matt Lee, MATT space LEE. and just reach out and say, hey, I'm interested in doing an integration. We'll always take a conversation like that, especially, if we can collaborate around a lead customer or something like that as well, because that can often help make the integration more high quality.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. All right. Back to you, Adam. Thank you for answering my questions.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, there's a huge long tail of those peripheral devices. So it's kind of crazy what we end up seeing, in the field. And you do see stuff that's like hyper legacy and all that as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is always interesting. So, but we do a pretty deep technical diligence process on that stuff. So cool. And then I think this is the kind of result that we got from that Amazon case study, and people can fully access this on Amazon's website. So we're not saying anything that's not already public there. But the big data points, there's an 8% reduction of unexpected downtime due to code errors, 25% reduction of resolution time for severe code issues. So kind of seeing that kind of major benefit on preventing production issues by just having people kind of look at code changes and catch them earlier. And then from there, again, this kind of calls out the industrial, horizontal, and the different sorts of companies we work with, from large entertainment company, electric vehicle company, all these different sorts of companies that can use this product. And again, that shouldn't be probably particularly shocking for this audience, given the scope of vendors that we support, but it's just worth calling out that we're not actually highly verticalized in that way. And some vendors do tend to have solutions they say works really well for this customer, and other, as long as we have a tech fit, we can basically support your production. So Copia's vision for the future of industrial DevOps. So, again, this is kind of this DevOps stack. One thing that has come up a lot is just as we're taking the next kind of step in this stack, we're going through, Git Base Source Control, automated testing, deployment management, observability and monitoring. We want to build that whole stack, from top to bottom, and build out that entire workflow for customers. And we've seen lots of interest in different parts of this. And so the big thing for us, and I think in general, if you're looking at this, is how to engage with people who actually want to drive process changes in organizations, and can kind of mobilize to enact those changes. The other key piece of this is, again, this kind of multi-vendor coverage across all these different vendors. And then, as we look forward to, AI-enabled workflows, what can you do once you actually have all the source control stored? Thinking about code generation, code analysis, all these different sorts of workflows, maybe generating tests, all these different, there's a million things you can build once you actually have, a standard set of practices, and you actually have, your code stored. So as you start to build out the right set of practices in an organization, you actually set yourself up for some of the next generation of stuff that's coming as well. And one thing that we do see in the IT space, and so I expect it will eventually have an impact, the OT space is a lot of AI-enabled DevOps tools. So basically trying to figure out how to build developer workflows and make them work better. And of course, the wrinkle in the industrial space is you get a lot of sustainment folks. And so figuring out, like, if your job is you maintain 150 devices, your job might involve a lot more debugging than writing code on a day-to-day basis. So how do you make that easier, and that sort of thing as well. Cool. And that's everything I have here. Do you have any questions, any other questions for me coming on this stuff?
I just want to go back into that one slide, the previous slide there on the DevOps stack. And this is and I love how you put Industry X.0, because I know a lot of people are trying to push Industry 5.0, and it's like, are we done with 4.0 yet? But in any case, I love the DevOps stack. Git Base Source Control. So there's other ways to do source control, right? And I think a lot of people still are using folders on servers, but using Git, and we go into this in great detail in our first podcast, it's just an industry standard, right? So you're using the industry standard, which means you can leverage, when you're training younger people, they're learning what the rest of the industry is using, right? And then automated testing. This is something I think that we don't have a lot of, and that's something that's important, right? And getting those reports in that dashboard of knowing when something's changed. It's like, somebody worked on line 3 yesterday. Nobody was supposed to touch that. That's our moneymaker. Why is there a change on line 3? And you can immediately reprioritize your day as the engineering manager or maintenance manager and try to get that before you find out you made $1 billion worth of bad products, right? And then deployment management and observability and monitoring. So I can see definitely some very interesting things coming from Copia in the future to address this entire stack. But I do love how you guys are working so hard with all those PLCs to do the visual. I mean, doing the upload and save, that's one thing, but visualizing the changes for all those different vendors, PLC vendors, from my world, that's what I'm thinking. That gives you, because most plants do have more than one PLC. It's just the way the world works, right? You can't have all one vendor. Most homes don't have all Hondas or Toyotas or Chevys or, and it's just the way things work out. So, just looking at the slide, it really, to me, it's a capstone on your presentation. And I would recommend, anybody who's interested, read that blog. I think it was aws.amazon.com /blog/industries. Check that and then you'll see the blogs up there. Check that out. I'm sure there's a link on Copia's site as well. But it was a very interesting 80% reduction in downtime based on code errors, right? So if you can eliminate all the little mistakes that are being made out there when you have hundreds of PLCs, then that can go right to the bottom line. But did you want to add anything to that, Adam?
No, and I really appreciate that breakdown here. And I will say, we like to talk about the big vision of industrial DevOps, but a lot of this is, as you mentioned, supporting a bunch of different vendors, supporting a bunch of different workflows, and really ideally building a tool that is actually solving a real problem, at the plant level, right? So when you talk about like an 80% reduction in outages from code changes, and you pair that with data that we've seen and corroborated just from our experience working with customers of like a huge increase. I think our number from our industrial DevOps report is 50%, but a huge increase in frequency of code changes, configurations, et cetera. Just a lot more automation in this space. You can see this as like a systemic problem that organizations face. And when you look at best practices like disaster recovery, that's just a fundamental best practice, right? So when you look at the kind of root of this from you need to solve disaster recovery, there are a lot more code-related outages that are happening in these environments, and they're due to changes, and there's no visibility or ability to manage those changes. Then you're like, okay, well, can you build a tool that really solves for those workflows and actually makes people's lives easier and makes it easier to maintain production, right? And so that's really our goal here. And so we can always go really high and talk about industrial DevOps and Git, which is amazing, and automated testing, and how do you manage deployments and observability. We can go into AI, and I think all these are going to be insanely useful tools, but it's worth calling out that the core of it does drive that ROI of uptime, and it does drive that increase in organizational efficiency, and it is ultimately strategic because it changes, how your engineering teams actually operate and unlock their ability to bring new production to market, and also, maintain more production, and more scale and scope of manufacturing production. So it ends up being this really powerful set of practices, and it starts with a relatively tight investment of backup and source control, but then you can build this entire world out of it that can really change how you as a controls engineer, but if you're an engineering manager, how your teams operate, or if you're a director, how your whole organization or company could operate. So it's very powerful in that way.
Yeah, and I think for some of the more seasoned engineers out there, the efficiency, how you're going to be so much more efficient with a solution like this, that's the one thing you're not seeing in any of these reports, but it's just huge. There's a source control package is going to just increase your efficiency, exponentially. You just cannot be as efficient using folders on a server and renaming the file with the date you changed it, and not having no automated backups, no automated difference reports. So, I know a lot of people are like, I've worked around this my entire career, and I have a kind of a system, but these things, these are leverage, and of course there's not enough of us out there. So like Adam was saying earlier, right? There's not enough operators, there's not enough controls guys. So, just think of the efficiencies when you go to a package like this. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Adam, for the final word.
No, that's great. And just dovetailing off that, I mean, even just the efficiency of if you have a backup practice in your organization where you once a month are backing up all your devices, how much time are you spending doing that? And even with that, you get an ROI. So
absolutely.
You're totally right. It's just there's not enough controls engineers. There's lots of production that needs to get built. And can we make the entire workforce that is building fundamental infrastructure more efficient? And can we build more awesome stuff, that's highly impactful. So, especially, production is disinflationary and all that stuff. So let's make more stuff and make it cheaper,
Yeah. Make it better, cheaper, and faster.
Yeah, exactly. Let's do it. So anyway, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's always really fun. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we have something really exciting, 12, 18 months when we're on the show again.
I
Or
appreciate
hopefully,
it, Adam.
but, hopefully we get to share some cool updates in the near future. So,
Awesome. Yeah, we'd love to have you back. Thank you again, Adam, for coming on.
yep. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I want to thank Adam for coming back on the show to bring us up to speed on what's new with Copia Automation. And I also want to thank Copia for sponsoring this episode, which is why it was completely ad-free. Isn't that nice? If you'd like to learn more about Copia Automation, please check out the links in the show notes. And if you'd like to gain access to all of my content ad-free, you can do so by subscribing either on YouTube or at theautomationblog.com. By clicking on that join button. It's just $10 a month. And with that, I hope you all have a great week. I want to wish you all good health and happiness. And until next time, my friends, peace.